Morning, everyone. Welcome to our fall season of Ripped from the Headlines. Hope everyone had a nice holiday season. And as we get underway, I will take a topic that can be timely from the Parshios of the week, the idea of Pru or Revu, to be fruitful and multiply. As well as something that I think has been in the news, and different aspects of it have been on my mind for a while, ever since seeing a couple of sources that we'll look at in just a few minutes. But it's the idea, we know that in Judaism, Pru Uravu, being fruitful and multiply, the idea of having children, of procreation, of ensuring the next generation is critical. I'd like to try and explore it more textually from the perspective of Jewish law. Beyond be fruitful and multiply is the familiar expression mentioned both to Adam and Chava, who we mentioned to Noach as well. In this week's Parsha, we know how fundamental the idea of having children is as a plot line throughout the book of Bereshis. The matriarchs have difficulty having children. The idea of they long for it. I spoke a little bit about the idea of the Jewish family on Rosh Hashanah because of that theme, especially each day of Rosh Hashanah's Torah reading and Haftorah. God remembering Sarah, Yishmael's saga, binding of Isaac, the roles of Avraham, Sarah, Hagar, the idea of Hannah wanting a child, Shmuel, the idea of the Jewish people being called God's treasured child. And this is definitely something that is ingrained in the Jewish psyche, the Jewish soul. So let's approach it. And it happened to be that this was a headline just a couple of days ago. It's a Newsweek article. Source number one, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. told a White House press briefing that the declining U.S. fertility rate is a national security threat, and warned it is not high enough to ensure the American population remains stable. Kennedy was speaking to the press after Donald Trump announced his administration had struck a new deal to reduce the cost of fertility medication, right, in the hopes of encouraging families. So this has been something that's been discussed for a long time. A couple months ago, source number two, U.S. birth rate hits all-time low. Fertility rate in the U.S. dropped to an all-time low in 2024, with fewer than 1.6 children being born per woman, federal data released Thursday shows. The U.S. was once among only a few developed countries with a rate that ensured each generation had enough children to replace itself, about 2.1 kids per woman. But it has been sliding in America for close to 2 decades as more women are waiting longer to have children, never taking that step at all. This new statistic is on par with fertility rates in Western European countries, according to World Bank data. In the early 1960s, the U.S. total fertility rate was around 3.5, but plummeted to 1.7 by 1976 after the baby boom ended. Gradually rose to 2.1 in 2007 before falling again, aside from a 2014 uptick. The rate in 2023 was 1.621, but inched downward in 2024 to 1.599. But who's counting? According to the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics. So we see a plummeting birth rate, a declining birth rate, right? The idea of, as I always mention, whenever we are blessed to celebrate the birth of a third child in a family, that it's not just a simcha for the family, but it's a simcha for the Jewish people. Because as we see in this data, our replacement rate is somewhere about 2.1. And since we haven't been able to figure out exactly to have the 0.1 child, 2 children per family means the Jewish people are shrinking, and 3 children per family means the Jewish people are growing. So 3 children is the growth of the Jewish people. The birth rate in Israel is averages over 3. In the Orthodox Jewish community, even in the U.S., it's over 3. In the non-Orthodox community, it's more in line with the American numbers, 1.6, 1.7. So this is something that impacts a society, maybe rising to the level of a national security threat, but certainly impacting society and culture. They talk about an aging population without children, As I have written about bringing kids to shul, there's nothing sadder than there being no children. The fact that just numbers wise, if you see source number 3 for an example of the numbers, most of this year's high school graduating class was born 18 years ago. Right, class of 2025, born in 2007, American families welcomed more than 4.3 million new babies. And they've been welcoming fewer ever since. Only about 3.6 million were born in 2024. In other words, the class of 2025 is the largest we're likely to see for the foreseeable future. We're having fewer and fewer children being born. 4.3 million, 3.6 million sounds like a lot, but you're going down. In 18 years, you're dropping some 700,000 fewer births. That's not a very good trend. So against this backdrop of information, let's look a little bit at the Torah's view, which is really summarized with, God says, Pru Urvu, be fruitful and multiply. Now, the question is, where else does this appear as a commandment in the Torah? And I mention that specifically because this verse, as we see, is Bereshit chapter 1, Genesis 1. It's the beginning, and in many ways there were no Jewish people yet. This is a command given to humanity, and it's not necessarily something that is repeated at Sinai. In general, this is a part of a larger discussion we often have this time when we're reading these portions of the Torah with regards to, we're going to read about, I guess, this week, the birth of Avraham, next week, the story of Avraham. People often say Avraham was the first Jew. Now, we kind of, talk about the patriarchs and matriarchs being Jewish. We have rabbinic traditions as to their observance of commandments. Even so much as saying they ate matzah on Pesach is something that the Midrash talks about. The idea that Judaism was something that they intuited, that they practiced on their own without there being a commandment. At the same time, it's very complicated because we believe that we are Jews and we have the mitzvos, we have commandments because of Sinai. So how do we understand these pre-Sinaitic commandments? And here it says, Pru Urvu. Anybody familiar with a Sinai, post-Sinai source for having children? Right, it seems to be obvious, and we say that you should teach your children and the like, but there doesn't seem to be a repetition of this commandment. And one of the things that the Talmud discusses is it says that anything that is mentioned before Sinai is also repeated after Sinai. So, for example, classic example is circumcision. Bris Milah, Avram is commanded to circumcise himself and his offspring and all of his descendants. So that's an Abrahamic command, but when does it become specifically a Jewish mitzvah? And we know that the Torah does say that in Parshas Tazria, when it talks about some of the details and the ritual details of childbirth, it says that on the 8th day, you have a circumcision. And we even learned from there the rules that it has to be on the 8th day, even if it's on Shabbos, all sorts of other details. So circumcision is repeated. Pru Urvu isn't repeated. We don't have a directive the same way to be fruitful and multiply. So the rabbis in Sanhedrin, where they're one of the places that they address this subject, mention that there is a directive that elevates or amplifies Pru Urvu, and it's in the aftermath of giving the Ten Commandments. Part of the preparation period for getting the Torah at Sinai involved purification, ritual purification, avoiding impurity, going to the mikveh, as well as avoiding marital relations. And in the aftermath of the giving of the Torah, the verse says, "Shuvu lachem la'ahalechem," go back to your tents. And so for the rabbis understand that there was a directive here. Going back to the tents means go back to family life, go back to the idea of marital relations and intimacy, and for the holy purposes of having children, right? The idea that intimacy is a major part of it is bound up with procreation. So therefore, when the Torah says return to your tents, it meant to amplify, be fruitful and multiply as a commandment, as a mitzvah, after Sinai. So you have, the rabbis are sensitive to the fact that there's a directive of pru or revu, be fruitful and multiply, but it doesn't appear as a mitzvah the same way other commandments do, even repeated as directly as other mitzvahs do. And therefore, they also invoke a verse from Yeshaya, Isaiah, source number 5, that God said, right? For thus said God, the creator of heaven, who alone is God, who formed the earth and made it, who alone established it, who did not create it a waste, but formed it for habitation. In Hebrew, it's lo sohu v'ro l'sheves yitzara. God is saying, I created this world. I didn't want it to remain empty. I want it to be habitated. I want it to be populated. And this declaration at which God says, I am God, seems the idea that there's being a directive presented, or Isaiah seems to be reiterating God's purpose in creating the world was for there to be population. And the idea that he mentions at the end of the verse, Ani Hashem, seems to be also the idea that what God is saying is that yes, you should be populating the world. And so the rabbis look at this verse in Isaiah as another example of there being a mitzvah of procreation. At the same time, when discussing this, it is filtered through two different approaches. One is the technical and legal, and one is the more thematic and the idea of creating a legacy. The idea that children are not just technical, having a certain number of children and a certain mitzvah obligation, but there's a certain legacy. The idea that the whole purpose of living is to pass it on to the next generation. And that's what we'll look at in a minute through the sources. Questions or comments before we go a little bit further afield? Until now, we've seen pru revu, be fruitful and multiply, becomes a springboard for this Jewish idea of mitzvah, of procreation, of having a family, even though it doesn't really say exactly what that means. Then the need to try and tie it to an actual commandment, as well as the idea of it being a value that the world shouldn't be empty. And we'll take that through some of the details in a minute. But questions, comments, anything else?
This may be way off, Rabbi, but doesn't it say somewhere that you shouldn't waste your seed? There's a prohibition to do personal.
Sure. No, sure.
So if you're wasting a seed, it means you're not having procreation.
So correct. So that's when we talked about the fact that the Talmud talks about return to the tent as being the amplification of the idea of there being a mitzvah for procreation. That's the idea that Jewish marital relations, intimacy, a major thrust of that is technical, of having children. The idea of intimacy having a kind of having another track of there being the relationship between husband and wife is also something that is focused upon. But generally, the more practical is marital relations are to have children, right? That it impacts the whole birth control conversation, and it will impact the idea of spilling the seed, the prohibition against that. So a major piece of all of this surrounds the idea of procreation. But first we have to see that the idea of pru revu seems to be a mitzvah, but it doesn't seem to be a very specific mitzvah, right? So as for example, as we turn to source number 6, where Shulchan Aruch mentions some of these laws, it becomes a legal category, be fruitful and multiply. You notice it starts off by saying, once a man has had a son and a daughter, he fulfilled the obligation to be fruitful and multiply, right? Jewish law officially only obligates men to be fruitful and multiply. Now, that's kind of strange considering they're not the ones being fruitful. They're not the ones actually facilitating giving birth, the multiplication. And so, how that plays out, in a technical format, the fact that we have be fruitful and multiply, the fact that we have the world should be populated, the fact that we have a certain religious purpose to marital relations, all of that comes together. But the first track of this as a technical legal obligation is, no, it's only for men. So we'll touch upon certain things, you can extrapolate from this certain scenarios that could become more complicated. Right, so you have a husband and a wife who are building a family. They want to have children. It says here that if they have a son and a daughter, they fulfill the obligation to be fruitful and multiply. Well, what about more children? So you see, even though he's fulfilled the obligation of fruitful and multiply, he's forbidden from being without a wife. He needs to marry a woman who's capable of bearing children. The idea that it's not just about pru urvu in the technical legal sense, it's about the building the family sense and having a wife who's capable of having children, so that maybe this is, as you mentioned, the idea that the seed should not be wasted. There shouldn't just be the marital relations that don't have the potential for an end goal, right? And this can carries into the issues, like I said before, issues of family planning, birth control. So you may be thinking, well, we're getting up to Abraham. Abraham was married to Sarah; she couldn't have children. And the idea that after 10 years of not being able to conceive, that's when the Hagar came in. The idea in Jewish law, the rule of that technically, if a husband and wife are married for 10 years, then there could be the possibility of more readily being willing or to force a divorce between the couple, because these are the legalistic components that surround it, and we'll see some of this beyond that. But on the one hand, be fruitful and multiply is a technical obligation. Seems that there's having a son and a daughter. Like, what happens if a guy has 10 sons? Great for the population, not necessarily great for pru urvu. So we see that the idea of fruitful and multiply is the springboard. One direction is the legalistic technical obligation. Minchan Chinuch, who's the commentary on the Sefer HaChinuch, points out that you have to recognize here that while our rabbis do create a very legalistic lane for pru urvu, that doesn't seem to be the driving purpose here. And so he says in source number 7, we have this idea as presented. You can create all sorts of scenarios for the legalistic lane of pru urvu. Right? We said a son and a daughter is required, so 5 sons doesn't cut it. Or what happens if a person has children and they pass away in his lifetime? He had children, but they don't have children of their own. So, because it says, near alil de mitzvazu ena kishar mitzvos lulav umatza v'domehem. You can't say being fruitful and multiply is the same like lulav, right? You take the lulav, you shake the lulav, you put down the lulav. You bake the matzah, eat the matzah, done with the matzah. Right? These are essentially one and done, right? You can check off a box. Right? When you engage in the sexual relations, that the mitzvah is not done. Heksher mitzvah, right? That's the beginning of a process. Ikar mitzvah hu leidas habanim. You have to have children. The idea that you can't just look at this as the birth of children. This is a process. And the Minchas Chinuch is understanding this as a process, just in getting married, in conceiving children, they're being born, and then kind of a ... ellipsis. You are involved in this mitzvah. Pru urvu isn't the same as being able to check off a box. You could technically certain aspects of it, but the Minchas Chinuch is the one to have us step back and look at the entire process of pru urvu. The idea of being fruitful and multiply. Yes, we can give you a checklist of things that you can check off to technically fulfill the mitzvah, but it's not the same as there's an action and there's a fulfillment. Right? We usually often talk about the chiyuv, the obligation, and the kiyum, the fulfillment. So here, there are multiple chiyuvim, multiple steps that are necessary to check off to fulfill the obligation. But the pru urvu is really more of a state. It's not a state of mind, but it's a state of religious activity. And you see Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, the contemporary rabbi and author Penine Halacha, gives us a couple of examples of how this plays out. Let's look at source number 8. All right, if someone was predeceased by his son and daughter, but had a grandchild from each, he has fulfilled his obligation to his grandchildren. Right? You see that Puravu, we said before, if the children die in his lifetime, you don't fulfill the obligation. But if a person's children sadly predecease him, but they have children, the grandchildren, it's like passing the baton. It's kind of, I can't have you put tefillin on for me, but grandchildren help me fulfill the mitzvah of Puravu. What matters is for his descendants to continue after him through his son and daughter. So Rabbi Melamed is acknowledging that there is this technical son and daughter consensus fulfillment for Puravu, but really beyond the technical fulfillment, the importance is for the descendants to continue. Or another scenario, a non-Jew had children later convert to Judaism, right? What about someone who converts? Maybe they're converting beyond their child's bearing years. Some say that he fulfills his obligation to procreate if his children convert as well. Okay, if the children convert and he converts, or even if you have a younger family, right? It happens, it's not uncommon. You could have a husband who you could have a couple, intermarried couple. Husband is not Jewish, wife is Jewish, kids are Jewish. He converts. His kids are now Jewish. He's Jewish. What's the relationship? Remember, we say about a convert. Convert is like a newborn child. Right? One of the issues I raised to show just how transformational conversion is if someone comes to me and is interested in conversion, I describe that this is such a transformation that if the individual will convert and their sibling converts, right? A man will convert and his sister would later convert. These brother and sister, according to Jewish law, can marry each other because they're not violent, they're not viewed as religiously related. Now, we don't apply that because it's kind of sick. And we never want Judaism to be less accepted than the rest of society, which would never allow this type of siblings to marry, but it's very transformational. Yet we're saying that even though both parents and children went through this conversion process, for Puravu it's enough. Why? Because it's about continuity. Others maintain even if children did not convert to Judaism, fulfilled the obligation of procreation. Right here, if you have someone who had children, he converts, and the children don't convert, that person still has engaged in the mitzvah process of Puravu because he's left descendants. As we have seen, some people fulfill an important Torah command with every child they are privileged to have. Right, the idea that we're applying a mitzvah designation to no matter how many children they have. Nevertheless, Torah established an obligation of every Jewish man to have one son and one daughter. Right, Rabbi Melamed is dealing with the fact that look, we don't want this to be just looked as a technical one son, one daughter, check the box. Every child. Sages add a rabbinic obligation to have even more children for two reasons: tremendous value of life and to ensure fulfillment of a Torah commandment. Even when it was a son and a daughter, cannot be sure that he will take part in the general objective of mitzvah, namely the son and daughter will continue the family line. Right? The idea, some even take this as far as that it's not just about the biological continuity, but it's also Judaism. It's not just having children, it's having children carry on the tradition of Torah and mitzvah. So the idea of Puravu may start as we've seen, it really starts as a principle. It never says, it's be fruitful and multiply. It doesn't really give any details. And the fact that it doesn't even have a real commandment post Sinai, thou shalt have a son and a daughter. But we have Puravu, we have Isaiah, the world's is meant to be populated. And so there's the track of the technical and there's the track of the sacred necessity of ensuring the next generation. So, sometimes the two will collide. And, so we talked before about, what happens, in a situation, where it's difficult to have children. And, in the modern day, we've had, the miracle of science, which has allowed for fertility treatments, for other types of opportunities to try and move to have children. But what about, is there a mitzvah to do that? Right? How far do you have to go? So there was an article, and just a couple of lines from an article, because it quotes Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. The title of the article has to do about refusing fertility treatment. Source 9, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach ruled that a couple has no obligation to undergo IVF in order to fulfill Puravu. No reason is provided for his ruling. It could be well that he held that doing so is beyond the extent that persons are obligated to exert themselves to fulfill the mitzvah, to fulfill a positive commandment. Right? In general, you don't have to give your life for commandments other than the three cardinal sins. How far do you have to go? how intrusive the state, how expensive, how intrusive, how complicated, how difficult physically or emotionally does one have to go? That becomes a question. And so, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, as an example, that there's no obligation to undergo IVF. Wife can't force the husband, or husband can't force the wife. Neither. Look, it's a challenge, and we have to be sensitive. But there's no. It's not that, like serving kosher. You have to keep kosher. Here, this is something that becomes challenging. And now, just to add, and we've touched upon this in other classes, the idea of IVF's permissibility in general, or recommended, being recommended, is complicated. We've talked about the idea in terms of how this plays out in Jewish law. For the most part, we skip to the conclusion that it's in many communities it's it's certainly okay and definitely an option. But we get to the upshot from this source is this idea that it's a mitzvah, but it's not necessarily a mitzvah that you can impose the same way as other technical mitzvahs because of the sensitivity that is involved. Questions, comments, and then I want to look at another couple of this idea of how fruitful, right? How fruitful we should be. It's not just about the numbers; it's about continuity. It's also not just about the numbers and the activity. There are sensitivities as well. So I wanted to look at, what was it, a question? Unmute.
My question is, or my comment is this kind of thing discussed in like our day schools, our high schools, where kids can get it as part of their Jewish education, do you think?
So I think some have it in different ways. I know, I've only sent kids to one Jewish day school so far, that at Ramaz, where, there is a class. For many years, there was a class taught by Rabbi Lookstein that was kind of a tongue-in-cheek called Sex with the Rabbi. And, but families and these types of values were introduced. At the same time, I think that's something that it's definitely, in my analysis, is not enough. It's like, just as an example, someone once came to me and said, do they ever talk directly about not intermarrying? And you would think that it's intuitive not to intermarry, but if you don't talk about something, and I still remember, and this was not someone who this was relevant for, but I remember talking to someone who's the first time they ever sat next to a girl in a classroom was Harvard Business School. So if on the one hand, you're on a lane to stay committed, but then if you don't have a conversation about it, once you end up in another lane, it becomes more complicated. And so I don't know if you know anyone who's involved in schools. We should. No, but so I think that look, it's a good point, and makes me think about how to bring this to families, outside of just the sheer context. It's a great point.
Yeah. So I know a man who was a big donor to a local day school, co-ed day school, and he stopped because his feelings were that they weren't, like, there were kids coming out of school, getting married, and like putting off having children for so long because no one told them that it's a Jewish value.
Right. So I think that sometimes the things which would seem to be the most fundamental don't end up being reinforced because we may take it for granted.
Right.
And yep. So so there's it's the importance, it's the technical importance, it's the Jewish future importance. It's complex and has to be treated as such. But I had come across an article. Really, it was in an post-October 7th article that it was unfortunately, but there's been a spike in suicides in Israel. Those who survived Nova, their relatives, others who were involved, and there was one particular that had been a bus driver who I think it was about 15 months ago. Someone who had witnessed a lot on October 7th took his life. And there was an article by Dr. Jeremy Brown in his blog about it was about giving up, and it was a Tisha B'av theme, and so the fact that on the one hand we fight, on the other hand sometimes Jews give up, and sometimes giving up is the heroic. Example, Masada, or other times in Jewish history where Jews committed suicide rather than fall to their enemy. And so the question was, is there a time, maybe, we read in Koheles, there's a time to, Eis Laledes, Eis Lavos, a time to be born, a time to pass away. Is there a time not to give birth or not to procreate? And the Talmud actually talks about this in source number 10. Reish Lakish says, prohibited for a person to have conjugal relations in years of famine, so that children not be born during these difficult years. And this actually comes up, in the story of Yosef. We're in the Bereshis theme, but when Yosef is in Egypt, and it mentions that he had 2 sons, and it says that he had 2 sons before the famine. And the rabbi, that's where Reish Lakish's teaching comes from. He had their sons before the famine because it was during the famine, and he and his wife would not be procreating because it's not the right time, right? There's not enough food anyway. Why bring in more mouths to feed? So this is mentioned as a law in Shulchan Aruch, source number 11, where it says you can't do this. You basically, you have to be concerned about this. And the Ramah has a comment that it's not just famine. He says, Bishar Tzoros Shehem Kera'avon, at the end of source 11. Other tragedies, other difficult times like famine are the same as famine. And so, are there times that we don't want to bring children into the world, right? And you hear the sentiment of some people talking about not having children today, and why there's been such a decline in birth rates because people are delaying. How could I bring children into this world? These are the sentiments that we hear from very public figures and the like. And is there some truth to there being certain times where people say you can't have more children because the world is overpopulated? All sorts of all sorts of theories. But what about this one, where the Gemara, based on a story in the Torah, gives us some pause for procreation? And so Jeremy Brown quotes a couple of sources, and he goes some rabbinic discussion. Source number 12 was a Rabbi Shimon Pollack from Hungary, and he was writing with regards to reacting to World War I. World War I was devastating for much of Europe, and many Jewish communities were moved, and everyone was moving around, and there was a lot of trauma. And he writes, I've seen with my own eyes these terrible times of trouble, with voices wailing in new refugee camps that were established by the government for our bereaved brethren, that there were no ritual baths for women to use. As for myself, I'm extremely distressed and wonder if in these times of sin, anger, war, and famine, if it's permitted for anyone to have conjugal relations. This is not just for the pious, this is absolutely prohibited for any couple. In light of all this, I'm not ruling in general terms for all people, rather my rulings for those who are able to withstand the temptation. For those whose urge is too powerful to resist, it is better to choose the lesser 2 evils. Each person should make their own decision. This is a deeply private matter. So he's talking about, on the one hand, if there's no mikvah, there's no mikvah. And that was one major challenge. On the other hand, maybe even if there is a mikvah, maybe this is not the time to procreate. This is not the time to have more children. And he is kind of sensitive to the point that was raised earlier about spilling the seed, that if you can't resist the temptation, there have to be marital relations, well, then there has to be, and you shouldn't hold back for that. And maybe there's a lesser of 2 evils, and even in times of difficulty, you should still engage in marital relations. And he says it's a very private matter. But he's entertaining the thought during World War I, with all the displacement, all the difficulties, maybe you don't have Pru. Just, he puts it out there. That was World War I. World War II, source 13, Rabbi Yisrael Altolando, another Hungarian rabbi. You see, he died in 1942. He actually died before Hungarian Jewry was devastated by the Nazis. So he was experiencing World War II, but it was not yet the terrors, not the same as in Poland, not the same as elsewhere, but he's addressing the World War II reality. Israel is enslaved in most countries in Europe, and also here, both physically and spiritually. We are made to work very hard, just as we did in Egypt. We have to repair the roads. In many places, yeshiva and mikvah have been closed. Again, could be a mikvah technical issue. Because there are many sins, there are new decrees against Israel each day. May God have mercy on us, and may we see his deliverance very soon. As a result, it would seem fitting for every Jewish husband to separate physically from his wife and not engage in marital relations, even if he himself is not in any danger, for it is a time of great hardship for Israel. So you see there's entertaining the possibility that maybe when the going gets tough, there's a pause in Fruitful, possibly. So that's kind of those who are taking this idea of not procreating during times of famine, the Ramah saying any periods of hardship can be like that, and rabbis entertaining this as a possibility. Again, the closing of mikvos could be amplifying or strengthening those thoughts, but there's this idea that when there's times of despair, Fruitful may be put on hold. And then you have a counter, point. This is Rabbi Chaim Eliezer Shapira, the Munkacher Rebbe, and Jeremy Brown thinks that he's responding to some of the sentiment that was expressed in World War I. I heard of a certain leader who ruled that conjugal relations were absolutely forbidden for the duration of the First World War, right? This brought me to incredible laughter, which this old man had warned against, and which he had ruled for his children. It made a laughing stock of us all. When we heard of this, our hearts would sink, for this ruling had no basis. Terrible thing to speak of such a thing. Perhaps much was hidden from the eyes in the thinking of this old man. May the master forgive him. Still, he should be given some respect. But nevertheless, the practical laws that heaven forbid would we ever prohibit this. You see, Rabbi Spira, Munkacher Rebbe, is pushing back. No, right? That's not how Jews respond. Jews respond by always planning for the future. And so I think that in addition to what we see in the idea of be fruitful, multiply, we know this is where the idea of Jewish families and having children and large Jewish families and the large ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic families we know comes from Fruitful. But to recognize it's something that is more than just a technical legal obligation, because its presentation doesn't really fit the mold of a regular mitzvah. It's a value before Sinai. It's not explicit after Sinai. It's a concept that goes beyond the technical man having son and daughter. It's about continuity. It can be complex and very personal. And it seems to be very much at the heart and soul of we're surviving, right? Those families that had children after the Holocaust, not to give Hitler a posthumous victory is something that's very much a strong emotional sentiment for a very important spiritual principle. Happy to take any questions, comments, or reactions.